So you've heard and seen online all about the northern lights that we've been experiencing in 2024 and very likely will continue to enjoy in a part of 2025. And you want to get involved in the photography fun. The good news is it's not that hard to get involved and get your own great shots. So in this video, I'm going to give you some quick settings right off the bat to suggest. I'm going to tell you why those settings make sense because that usually helps people understand a little bit. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about some B-level stuff that you may want to consider and what to look for when it comes to forecasting, because you can have all the settings and be ready to go. But if you go out on the wrong night or you miss going out on the right night, that's really going to be the make or break for the photography during this solar cycle. First off, if you've got an iPhone or an Android phone that does great at night, aim it at the sky and take your picture and just be done with it. If you're going to throw it on Instagram to show your friends and we're all going to look at it on small screens, you're going to be totally fine. It's going to look great. But if you want to take a picture, a high resolution image that you can maybe print later, or you can really pixel peep and do a lot of editing in, a mirrorless or a DSLR camera is still going to be the way to go. So the three main settings that we're looking at, of course, is ISO, aperture, and time. So let's talk about those three main settings right now. Here they are. 2500 to 3200 on the ISO. An aperture of f2.8 to 3.5 is generally pretty good. And then a shorter amount of time, 10 to 15 seconds. Dial those settings in there, go out and take your picture and have fun. There you go. But why? Why do we want to use those settings? I personally shoot ISO 3200 for all of my Milky Way stuff. And by the way, these settings are very close to what you'd get for Milky Way because you're trying to get as much light as you can in the shortest amount of time. However, there's some minor differences, which we'll talk about when it comes more to the time setting. 3200 for ISO works great for me. My camera handles higher ISO pretty well. Most new cameras do. And you get the benefit of still retaining some degree of color in Milky Way shooting. And of course, when you're shooting Aurora, that's all color. It would be very hard to completely wash out an Aurora at ISO 3200. If you have a camera that's known for its ISO invariance, which is the concept that you can shoot at a much lower ISO, bring it up in post later, if that's what you normally do, then stick with what you normally do. But for most people, that 2500 to 3200 range is going to work just fine. As far as your aperture goes, I never recommend that anybody shoots anything related to astro or night work below f2.8. A lot of lenses that go wider than that have soft corners, which for a lot of types of photography doesn't really matter, especially when you're talking about depth of field, but you will get what looks like squished stars in something called coma, or what I like to call flying pancakes. Some people call them UFOs. You know your lens, do whatever you think your lens is capable of, and certainly if you have a lens that can only get down to 3.5 or 4, you're still in good shape. You're going to do fine. Also, keep in mind that if you're going to be shooting at these wide apertures, your depth of field is going to be an issue. That's why a lot of these beautiful Northern Lights photos are typically sweeping landscapes so that people don't have to deal with that. If you've got something that's fairly close, maybe it's an old vehicle or a fence post or something like that, you may have to take two different shots in order to get the focus stacking correct. Just keep that in mind when you get your composition figured out. Time is really the most important thing here. It's how we collect the light. We're going to let this wash onto the sensor and build. However, unlike the Milky Way, which moves a little bit slower, Northern Lights in many cases are moving. You get these columns of light. It almost looks like one of those old Hollywood movie openings where they have the giant spotlight and the beams going up into the air. The longer your exposure is, obviously the more light you're going to get, but the more that definition is going to blur out like anything else that moves during a long exposure. So the key component here is to keep the exposures a little bit shorter than you normally would. 10 to 15 seconds is generally pretty good. That's where I put mine. You're playing that game, that balancing act of trying to build in enough time to bring the light in without having to worry too much about losing that definition. And every display might be a little bit different. By the way, if you're thinking about doing a time lapse, use the settings that I mentioned at 10-second intervals. That just gives you a little bit more of a frame rate, and just let that thing fly for a good 30 to 45 minutes. You'll end up with a beautiful time lapse. Some B-level settings that you may want to consider might be white balance. I always like to shoot in a manual white balance at night. Yes, if you're shooting raw file format, and you always should be, you can adjust that later, but this allows me to get a consistent series of shots in the field that are all the same white balance. I don't have to go back and fix individual photos later or have any weird problems as a result of the camera making a decision for me. I shoot at 3800 for all of my night work. I may adjust depending on what I shot later, but I find that 3800 works pretty well for me most of the time. Another setting that you really need to consider is a picture profile setting. For example, if you go into some cameras, they have the ability to kind of goose the tones a little bit. Like you can say I'm shooting landscape. I don't mean landscape orientation. I mean a landscape color profile. It might boost the greens a little bit. Or if you're shooting portrait, again, not portrait orientation, I mean portrait subject, it might goose the skin tones a little bit. You want to avoid all that. So in your camera, please set your picture profile settings, whatever it's called, with your particular manufacturer, to a flat or a neutral. That's the best way to go. It gives you the most easily editable and correctable file later. Highly recommend you turn off noise reduction, both in camera, long exposure noise reduction, and high ISO noise reduction. That noise reduction is baked in. You may not like how it works on the files, and you cannot undo it later. I'm using Lightroom's Denoise AI when I need to, and I'm completely thrilled with the results that I'm getting. Your mileage may vary, or maybe you're using Topaz Denoise. Whatever works great for you is what you should keep using, but I would avoid the in-camera noise reduction. Again, when it comes to night photography and manual photography in general, I try to make all the decisions and take that power away from the camera. I don't want the camera doing any real thinking for me. Image stabilization should be off. You should be manually focusing. Please do not try to autofocus under these conditions. Your camera may think it's focused, and it probably is not. The best way to focus is to blast a light on something in the distance, or look for a distant light source that is easily seen. Maybe that's a house on a hill or a blinking radio tower, and just manually focus using your live view screen. Digitally zoom in your live view. Don't optically, just digitally zoom in. Most cameras have a little magnifying button, and then make that light source as small as possible. And when that light source gets down to like a little pinpoint, that's typically when you're in focus. If all you have available are stars and you have one of the new mirrorless cameras, you may be able to do the same technique. I think Olympus has like a star focus, and that might be coming to Pentax. So those things are out there. Check to see if your camera has something like that. If you want to give your foreground a little extra boost, bring a light. Bring a nice wide beamed light, maybe a panel, something that can achieve a very low brightness. We're talking about 1% on most of these panels, because we're using very sensitive settings to take the actual image. A little bit of light is going to go a long way, like it did here on this shot of this old shack, this beach shack on the Cape Cod National Seashore. I really wanted to bring out those fall colors that were starting to pop and overpower a little bit of the pink glow that was hitting the ground, and a warm toned light at a low power allowed me to do that. As far as forecasting goes, guess what? The media has been doing a great job at doing that for you for the last several months. So if you start to see those articles pop up in the morning about, hey, there's another chance of northern lights this weekend or tomorrow night or tonight, you will really want to start paying attention and get those camera batteries charged. There are apps available as well. I use one called Aurora. It's great for everybody. It's easy to understand. The higher the number, the better your chances are. I find that it's a bit conservative. So if it says the KP index is a 5 or a 6, which is really great, and it may still say you have a 0% chance in your area, don't pay too much attention to that percentage. The best shows that I've had down here on the Cape, I had, according to that app, like a 3% capability of seeing the aurora, and obviously it ended up being fantastic. It's more about the KP number. You need a moonless week. Any moonlight at all is going to start kind of clamping down on those colors, because you've got moonlight, and moonlight is pretty bright. The higher we are in the full moon cycle, building up to it, the harder it's going to be to capture those rich colors. So ideally, a moonless week is really what we want. Obviously, we need some clear skies, but heck, Even if it's partly cloudy, go out anyway. We had a display here back in May of 2024 where it was almost complete cloud cover, but because the aurora was so bright and the cloud deck was relatively thin, the clouds ended up being backlit by the aurora, which was a really weird experience. I really hope this has been helpful. These are settings that have worked for me, but just remember, at the end of the day, it's about going out and looking at the northern lights with your own eyes, just like the eclipse. You can take great photos and enjoy all these photos later, but you can only enjoy the moment in the moment, right? So get some pictures, but just keep looking up. I sound like Jack Horkheimer. Those of you who are old enough will remember who that guy is. So keep your fingers crossed for more aurora this year and into 2025. And if you get out there and get some great pictures, awesome. But if you get out there and don't, and got to see it with your own eyes, you still won the night. Happy shooting.